Hi everyone, I'm Ann Cupolis, and thank you for joining me to talk a little bit about watercolor pigments. I'm a watercolor artist, and so these are kind of the things that I wish I had learned when I first started painting, and I thought that I would share them with you. So first off, let's talk about what are watercolor pigments. So watercolor basically are just ground pigments that are then mixed with a binder, such as gum arabic, for example, which is made from the sap of an acacia tree, and then have some other additives that are mixed together. So one of the other additives is water, for example. All of your watercolor pigments, all those expensive tubes, they have at least 10% water in them. But each pigment has different properties associated with it, such as strength, light fastness, the degree of transparency or opacity, and granulation. So we are going to talk about those today and how to get to know your pigments a little bit better. I talked about some of the additional additives. So you have additives such as oxgall. Oxgall is a wetting agent, and it is used for dispersing the particles throughout the watercolor mix. You also have glycerin, which aids in flexibility and adhesion and keeps the paint moist. So quite often there's also a thickener used like dextrin, which is used when the gum arabic isn't really enough body to suspend some of those heavier pigment particles in your mix. So that's really what watercolors are. They are pigment mixed with a binder, mixed with additives, mixed with a little bit of water. Most people ask me about the difference between pan paints and tube paints, and about the difference between student grade and artist grade paints. So I want to cover those with you right off the bat, and then we'll go a little bit deeper into properties. So the difference between pan paints and tube paints is just that really the biggest difference is that generally the amount of glycerin that's added is higher amount in a tube paint, because you need that glycerin to flow, and you need it to flow within the tube. So in a lot of pan paints, for example, I would consider these beam paints to be pan paints, even though they're not actually in pans. They're in this much more eco-friendly piece of birch, which I love. But these don't need to be squeezed out of a tube, and so they don't need to have that added glycerin that you have in a tube paint. So where that comes into play is sometimes when I'm teaching classes, my students will have a hard time getting coverage from a pan paint. So like, for example, if you're doing a background wash and you need to have a lot of coverage and a nice flow, you don't want the brush marks to show, for example, and you don't want things really drying on the paper while you're working with them. Part of it is the amount of water that you're using at the time, but also if there is a lack of glycerin, if you're working from a pan paint and it doesn't have glycerin in it, then you're going to have a hard time getting the flow. So if you prefer to use pan paints, that's just something you need to know. So you need to either work in smaller patches when you're doing a background wash, or maybe switch to a tube paint to do that background wash, and the colors will flow a little bit better. Some paints like Daniel Smith brand, I believe, our high quality artist brand, they use the same amount of glycerin in their tubes and their pans. So again, getting to know your paints, you'll learn these things as you learn what paints you like to use, not just what colors, but also what brands, and then you learn the properties of each brand. So that's the biggest difference here. The difference for me between a student grade paint, such as an artist loft, and then the artist grade paint, like a Winsor Newton or a Daniel Smith, is really in the amount and quality of the pigments that are used. So generally, dextrin and other fillers that you get in a student grade and a less expensive tube paint can make the pigment chalkier and less transparent. You also generally won't have as much granulation, which is that sedimentation, that beautiful sedimentation that you get when you're painting. And generally those are more expensive pigments because they have more of the actual pigment color in them. So how do you know the difference between student grade and professional grade? Well, one of the biggest ways to tell is just price. So if you're in the art supply shop and there are two sort of walls, and one of them you see the prices of each of the tubes of paint is anywhere from like $1 to $5 less expensive than another brand, then you can ask the person working in the shop if it's artist grade or student grade, because usually student grade is a few dollars less per tube. And when you're buying kits, you can get a kit like this for $5 or $10 somewhere like Michael's, and you would not be able to get that kind of a kit in a higher grade artist material. So price is number one. Other is you can go to the website. So some of the brands have both. They have a student grade and then they have an artist grade. So basically, when you're an art student and you can't probably afford as much or as fine quality of materials, you can start off like with the starter set of a student paint. It's still going to be better than buying something like this, okay? It's kind of like the student grade of Winsor Newton is still going to be like a BMW compared to buying a different kind of a car. You know, just like BMW has different series, you know, they're all still BMWs. So, but again, you can check the website and you'll see which brands have a student grade. And then as you graduate, you can graduate up to their more expensive version of paint. And also as you build skill, you can get better quality materials. So I always tell my students that buying expensive materials or buying better quality materials is not a substitute for practicing, but once you are starting to build skill and you know that you want to pursue this watercolor either as a career or as a serious hobby, then when you buy finer materials, it will improve the quality of your work. So that's a little bit about the common questions that I get. So I wanted to show you guys, we talked about the brands. There are a lot of really great brands out there. I'm not really beholden to one brand. I like different brands and I like different colors from different brands and so forth. But each of the top brands will have information on their sites or sometimes included with a watercolor kit. And they'll have information about the watercolors, and so you can learn about the different properties of your watercolors. So I just pulled up from the Daniel Smith website. So they have basically their regular series, which is called Extra Fine Watercolor. They have sort of specialty watercolors, and they have watercolor crayons and all sorts of things like that as well. But this is sort of their regular series. And this is their color chart, and this color chart gives you all the basic information about their pigments. So if you buy the colors from them, this is how you know what you're getting. You have a color key, a key to this up here, just like you would have a key on a map, and it kind of tells you how do you read this. So if you're reading this color information from left to right, you have here the light fastness rating. So that will show up here on the left. And if you go down to the first color, which is one of my favorites, titanium buff titanium, you can see it's here, right? And we'll go into each one in just a minute, but here's the code. So you'll see if this is light fast. And then what you'll see next is you'll see number 2, which refers to if it's a staining or non-staining color. So again, it's here on a scale of 1 to 4. You can see it comes next. Titanium buff is a 1. Then next you'll see it says yes or no. So that'll refer to granulation, which is the sedimentation property of the watercolor, and that will be here. So if you look at titanium buff, you've got a yes. And then you have this half circle, so this circle filled in, and that refers to the level of transparency of the paint. And again, if you go down, that will be the 4th symbol that you'll see here, okay? So that's how you read this. What you'll also see is you'll see these numbers down here. So these numbers, PW, PY, and so forth, these numbers at the bottom, this refers to the International Color Code Index, which, again, you know, is kind of self-explanatory that regardless of the brand, you can see what color they say that color matches across the boards. So rather than have a bunch of all like different fancy names, and nothing to compare it to. There is this international code, which is just letters and numbers, that tells you that, for example, that this Hansa yellow light is considered a PY3. So if you were to buy a PY3 in another brand, that should be the closest possible in that brand to that yellow light. Okay. There may still be differences between each of the brands when it comes to the Hansa yellow light, and we'll talk about that a little bit as well, but it will be really about as close as you can get. So there are other things that they tell you here after those, or above those numbers. It tells you what the color is available in, and this regard is just regarding their own product. So can you buy it in a tube? Can you buy it in a large tube or a small tube? Can you buy it in a half pan? Is it available in a color stick? So up here you could look at the Hansa yellow and you'll see it's available in the large tube, the small tube, the stick, and the pan. Other companies, for example, Winsor Newton is one that I use a lot, and they put a lot of small kits together. So they'll have like an old master's kit, or they'll have a primaries kit, or they'll have a kit that will be for outdoor painters, for example, or doing oceanscapes. So they basically curate colors into small kits. And on their color chart, they have codes that tell you which kit each of those paints is found in. So not every brand is going to have the same exact color chart, but they will give you an idea at least, and a lot of them will have a lot of similar information on them. So let's dive down a little bit and talk about what the properties are. What do those things mean? Okay. So first you have the light fastness rating. The light fastness rating is the degree to which the color is either light fast or if it's fading. And that quality derives from the pigment itself. It has nothing to do with the mixers or the brand or anything like that. So most earth colors in general are permanent, which means they're light fast. And most organic colors like vegetable dyes will fade over time, and they're not that light fast. Fading colors are also called fugitive, and you can see here that fugitive is listed as a 4 in Roman numerals on the Daniel Smith chart, and that's right here. So why does that matter? Why do you want your colors to be either light fast, either excellent, or very good, for example? Why do we care? Well, we care because if you're painting for fun, maybe you won't care. But if you're painting to sell your work, and you're selling your original work, then you will want it to not fade in the next 15 or 20 years. You're going to want it to live on. If you look at some of the old masters' work, for example, Turner, he did a lot of watercolor studies for his oil paintings, and he used earth colors like sepia in his notebooks. And they still are clear. You can look at them clear as day, and it's 250 years later. You can look and the colors are still the same. They have not faded, and that's because he was using colors with an excellent light fastness. They were earth colors, so they didn't fade over time. They stayed the test of time. Why would you make colors that are fugitive is a question I asked myself for a little while. Well, there's a reason. So things like vegetable dyes can produce very intense and stain-like colors, so they're excellent for illustrators. If you're an illustrator and your goal is for your paintings to be reproduced, then it really doesn't matter so much if the original is going to fade over time. What you care more about is the intensity of the colors. And so in that case, you might not have a problem using fugitive colors, but they're called out for a reason, because most artists, they want their originals to be able to have a history to them, to last a long time. When it comes to fugitive colors, a lot of fugitive colors used to have been replaced by new colors in the lab, luckily. So some of our pigments are made from organic materials, like minerals or other things like that, charcoal. But Again, vegetable dyes were used quite often, or parts of vegetable sap and things like that were used to make watercolor paints, and those generally wouldn't last, and those were considered fugitive colors, and fugitives are now being replaced. So when you see colors that are called, for example, like New Gamboge, which is down here, number 1. So you can see that New Gamboge right now, it has an excellent light fastness rating. But the original Gamboge, which was just called Gamboge, was made from a sap or a fruit, I believe. And it was this bright saffron in color, and it would fade very quickly. So the synthetic substitute for the fugitive organic pigment is called New Gamboge. So when you see a new in front of the term, that's all that means. That means that that is a synthetic color that has replaced what was previously only available as a fugitive color. Sometimes students will ask me, what is the difference between Gamboge and New Gamboge? Well, Gamboge isn't made anymore, so you shouldn't see that, but that's why the term new comes in front of it. So the ASTM stands for American Standard of Testing Methods International, and they've set the industry standard for light fastness testing, and they assign a rating scale, which is here in Roman numerals, of 1 to 4. Most pigments have a set standard, but there are some pigments where they may be specific to that brand only, kind of like a fancy special color, and that will have an NR because it's not rated. Daniel Smith tends to rate all of their colors, but they'll tell you when they don't use the international system, and they just use their own independent testing to determine if it's light fastness or not. So the next quality that you see that's listed here is the quality of staining. So when a watercolor is described as staining, it means that once you've laid down the paper, paint on the paper, and it dries, it is difficult or almost impossible to lift that color up or remove it. So heavily staining watercolor, so if it was like listed as a 3 or a 4, which is a medium or high staining color, you it might not be able to lift it off. Whether you're lifting it with water or a tissue, or even using a little trick I like to use, which is Mr. Clean Magic Eraser. Even Mr. Clean Magic Eraser cannot remove a highly staining watercolor in its entirety. So it's going to leave a hint of color or a mark on the paper. If you are using a non-staining paper or a low staining, that means you can lift it more easily. So if you look right here, you have a lot of these yellows, luckily, are non-staining or low staining. But we can find one, for example, that's fairly high staining, and that's this yellow right here. And this has listed as 3 as medium staining. So if I were, say, choosing and I wanted to do a lot of lifting, maybe I'm doing a painting with cantaloupe or lemon and I want to use this color, but I also want to lift off color to create highlights, I might choose not to use this yellow. I might choose to use either a Hansa, a New Gamboge, or even this Indian yellow, which looks like it might be similar. And I would just probably buy some little test swatches. And Daniel Smith sells these like little watercolor dots, and they also give out free samples all the time in stores. So ask the watercolor aisle guy. There's always like a dude who works in the watercolor aisle. Ask him if he has any samples of that color, and then you can kind of see if that's going to be one that works out for you. You don't want to just paint the yellow. You want to mix it with some of the other colors, like mix it with its complement to see what kind of toned down color you get when you take some of the chroma out of it, because it might lean red or it might lean a little more green. And so you really want to test the properties before you invest in that new color. But anyway, if you're thinking about using that kind of color and you want to do lifting, you want to look for a rating that's either a 1 or 2, non-staining or light staining. Some brands like Winsor Newton, they also sell a lifting medium, which you can use to help aid your lifting. It will work better than water if you like to use that technique of lifting color out in painting, and I think it is a very useful technique. Okay, so let's talk about transparency, and then we'll go to granulation next. So transparency is how transparent, how see-through, or how opaque, non-transparent your pigment is. So here, and in general, you'll see there are 3 different qualities. You'll have the pigment will be listed as either transparent, semi-transparent, or opaque. Some pigments have more of a jewel-like body that reflects light, but it veils the paper and it appears more opaque. And for example, a lot of artists don't like to use the cadmiums because the cadmiums are very opaque. So if you're looking for a yellow or a red that let a lot of light through and seem very translucent, then the cadmiums are going to be very heavy. They're not going to do that job for you. Ultramarine blue is another example. Ultramarine blue kind of veils the paper, and it has a great pigmentation to it. I'll show you guys in just a moment, but it's a very beautiful color, both in the original ultramarine, the French ultramarine, and any other variations. But it just is kind of opaque, and so it doesn't really work well for glazing, which is layering colors, and sometimes for mixing as well. So I'll show you guys. So if you're mixing color and you want to layer, for example, I like Hansa yellow because Hansa yellow is more transparent than cadmium yellow, but it's almost the same color. And if you want to layer a blue over that, your blue is going to kind of mask, and as you can see with the blue when I paint it on here, you can see it's kind of heavy, and it's not as heavy as some other colors, but it's not very transparent. So if you're trying to do any kind of glazing, which is when you let the colors dry completely and then you layer over them, you can still use the blue, but you'll want to know that you want to lay the blue down first. So if you lay the blue down first and then let it dry, you can glaze a more transparent color over it. So rather than lay the yellow down first and then try to glaze the blue over it, lay the blue down and then you would glaze the yellow over it. Obviously for glazing you need to let things dry. So other colors don't have a lot of body to them. They don't have a lot of sedimentation, and you can sort of see that granulation starting to happen in the blue. We're jumping ahead a little bit, but granulation is the sedimentation that you get when the pigment is mixed with water, then you adhere it to the paper. And when the water starts to evaporate, both in the air and into the paper, you're left with that sediment. Kind of like when you go swimming in the ocean and your bathing suit, then you dry it and you have salt crusted onto it when it dries, and that's because the water part of the equation will evaporate and the salt is left on the surface. And that's kind of the same thing that's happening. And when I hold this real close up, you can start to see that beautiful granulation happening in the blue. So yeah, why would I use ultramarine blue if it's not as transparent as other colors? Well, the actual hue itself is gorgeous, and also the sedimentation is beautiful. The flip side, it's not that transparent. Okay. Then you have the other colors, so for example, that are very bright, very transparent, kind of have a jewel-like color but don't have a lot of body to them. So the opposite would be this alizarin crimson, for example. Doesn't really have a lot of granulation. It's not a granulating color, although it looks like it is right now, but I think that's just the texture of the paper. It's a nice color. It's highly staining. This Prussian blue is another example. It lets a lot of light in, so you can create some really beautiful glowing effects. But what you're not going to get is you're not going to get that pigmentation. Okay. So knowing that, I think, is important, again, in terms of glazing, but also in terms of mixing your colors. Okay. Again, you would layer your ultramarine blue and then let that alizarin crimson or that Prussian blue layer over it. Okay. Yeah. You can also do what's called a black line test. If you guys want to learn more about your pigments, you can kind of, I would use a thicker pen normally and just draw a black line across and then layer your colors over it, and you'll really be able to see if they're transparent or not transparent by the degree to which you can see that black line shine through. Okay, and what you want to do is you just want to dilute the pigments with water, and then you'll see just a little bit, see how much you can see that black line through it. And you can do this with all of your favorite colors to get an idea of their transparency. You also can just go to your brand's website and see what they say about transparency. So let's take a look at one of these. For example, cadmium yellow. The transparency is listed as, this is cadmium yellow deep, it's listed as semi-transparent, for example. So if you wanted to use a more transparent sort of color that's close to this, you might want to go with New Gamboge, which is one that I like a lot. Both of them are warm yellows. Hansa yellow here, which is another, which is a little bit less orangey but still warm. Or lemon yellow, which is on the cooler side, although it doesn't really look cool here. It's still a yellow, it's still a warmer color, but it's a little bit cooler version, and it's a very transparent color. Okay. So hopefully that makes sense. Let's talk about granulation. So granulation is, again, the best way to describe it is the sedimentation. So it's the granules of the ground pigments that fall to the bottom of the mix when you apply it to your paper. There are some pigments that are highly granulating and are really just beautiful. Some of the ones I really like to use, for example, are Daniel Smith Cobalt Turquoise. It has a really nice granulation to it. Some of their more unique colors, I like also the Titanium Buff is granulating, and the two of these together are just beautiful. I really also like, since we're not on Daniel Smith, but I like Core for quinacridone, gold and red. They have different quinacridones. Those are really nice. So they all are really granulating, and they're gonna create a lot of beautiful sort of watercolor magic when you mix them with water, then you let them dry, and the pigments sort of form their own little sediment patterns on the paper. So there's a flip side to granulation too, is you might not want granulation in everything. So for example, when choosing a blue for skies, you might not want granulation in your sky. You might want a very transparent, translucent sky, in which case then you're going to want to choose a blue that looks like the sky that you're trying to paint, but is a non-granulating blue. Like a phthalo blue is a good alternative to cobalt blue. Cobalt blue is a lot of people's favorite blue, but I find it doesn't work so well for skies because it's granulating. And same with Prussian blue. Cerulean blue, Daniel Smith's version, is granulating, but for example, other brands are not as granulating. So you might want to take, if you like cerulean blue for skies, you might want to take a look at some other brands. You can see some really highly granulating pigments here in some of their specialty colors, like lunar blue, for example, is one. And then in this perylene green here. So yeah, take a look and get to know these properties. There's also an additive that you can buy, which is a granulation fluid, a granulation liquid, which is a supplement that you can purchase, which will add a granulation to any color. So that's kind of neat that you can do that. So really, how well do you know the properties of your own pigments? Well, there's really only way to find out, a couple of ways to find out. One is to check the charts. So take a look at your brands. I definitely urge you guys to take a look at the pigments that you have and go to the manufacturer's website and try to learn as much as possible as you can about your own pigments. So, by the way, the International Color Code will be on the actual tube. So you don't always have to go to the website just for that. But all of this other information is not on the tube or on the kit. So yeah, go ahead and look those up. And then the second thing you can do is just to play with your colors. So playing with your colors and looking them up are the two ways to really get to know what are the properties of your colors and really how to work with them in the way that you like to work with them. So I urge you to do some self-study on your own and also check out my color play workshop, which is coming in March. Thank you, everyone. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe.